There is a large amount of small artists that are also used in fraud schemes without knowing it. And the reason is if you're a fraudster, you can't just point the music back at yourself. Like if I steal accounts or if I create bots, I cannot only play my songs. It's like a giant arrow back to me. So what I need to do is create a haystack around my needle. And that means I need to pull people who don't know and then like build this apparatus as a shield. So I might
Oh,
have if I'm pretending to be an independent artist, I want to be on all these independent artist looking playlists. I want to be that I might create as a fraudster. I might want to have users that play a lot of my song, but not really all of my song. Like I want to have maybe thousands of other users that it looks like, oh, this user could just be an independent music lover and they just really like my song a little more than others. And so they will create these sort of scenarios and fields. But once that account is detected as fraudulent, all the other users that are associated and benefiting from that user streaming or that fraudulent account streaming, they will then be penalized and or have money removed. And so you sometimes get caught up or swept up into a fraud scheme. And if you think about that, to hide, I might play for one stream, I might need to play another thousand. And so if you think about it like that, that means like for every 100,000, I'm playing, 10 million. And that other 900, 9,900,000 streams, those artists didn't know.
that's
And so
crazy.
sometimes you're just caught into this giant web of lies or this like network of fraud as an artist because someone stumbled across you and thought, oh, we should plug them into this system and build as part of our sort of fraud apparatus.
Hello, you beautiful music creatives. My name is Mac, the founder of Musician Guidance, and it is my privilege to officially welcome you all to the Musician Guidance podcast. Today, we're joined by Andrew Beatty. Andrew is the co-CEO and founder of Beatdapp, a company focused on eliminating streaming fraud and ensuring fair compensation for artists, something I can totally get behind. Without further ado, it is my honor to welcome Andrew to the podcast. Andrew, you're looking great. How are you doing today?
Thanks, I appreciate it, and appreciate you having me on. And excited to be here and talk to people looking to release albums and learn more about the business.
Absolutely. And just to kick us off here, we're going to be talking about streaming fraud, about, how that affects artists. But just to start us off here, Andrew, tell us a little bit about your story and how you got into founding Btop.
Yeah, so I'm actually a five-time founder. I've built and sold a couple companies. As everyone's weird crypto friend, I don't need to tell you what the last companies were, but I started mining Bitcoin in 2011 and sort of started building a bunch of stuff in the space. And when you're everyone's weird crypto friend, they just assume crypto means blockchain. And back in like 2017, 18, blockchain was all the rage, and everyone was trying to figure out how to apply it to businesses. And we had a large label come to us and say, "Hey, can you please build an audit tool for streaming, like how many times songs are played?" And so we did that. My co-founders, who's my co-CEO Morgan, and my our CTO Poria, we'd all worked together in different contexts and known each other for a long time actually. And we kind of knew we wanted to do something together, so this seemed like the right opportunity. So we built an audit product that could track the number of times songs were played. A lot of people don't realize like when you get a report from a streaming service, it typically just says artist did 100,000 streams, but you don't actually know if that's right. It's like just in an Excel spreadsheet. So if you're a label and you get this Excel, you need to go back to the streaming services every so often and audit and say, how many times was this actually streamed? Is it correct? How many subscribers did you have? How much revenue? And are my calculations right? And often those calculations are wrong, anywhere between 10 and 30% off. We wanted to try and build, now that the industry as a whole is spending about $1 billion a year in auditing, and we wanted to try and solve that problem and build like a real-time audit solution. So that's originally what we started to build. When we built that solution, imagine you create a brand new layer of data capture. So, my partner Morgan often described it in the early days as like being a bouncer at a club. Like you have the guy that's looking at IDs and letting people in, but we're just sort of the check on the side, just going click, click, just focusing on usage, like the number of people coming through. And when you don't have all the other distractions and things built on top, you end up having the most clean, accurate number of that event. And what we started noticing in the data was all of a sudden weird discrepancies that we couldn't account for. Like, why are there, let's just call it 8,000 users playing a song 63 times on a Sunday? Just like really weird things that were occurring. And in a previous life, the previous startup with my co-founder, Poria, we had built a lot of machine learning products and a lot of data analytics tools. And so we kind of looked at each other and said, let's see how far this goes. Like if it's only a small percentage, it's not a big deal. Audit works great. And you're within a margin of error. If it's a really big percentage, having the source of truth and saying this is the number, but it's not actually the number because you have these other problems, like that no longer works. So you can't have an audit product that's inherently flawed. And so what we ended up having to do was focus on streaming fraud, not because we thought there was this big streaming fraud problem, but because we sought out to solve a different issue and accidentally stumbled into streaming fraud. And the problem was so big that it was something we couldn't ignore. And so truly, we had to be the best at catching fraud in order to be the best at audit. And that's where we're at today. Like we're the leader in fraud detection for the music industry.
It's awesome to hear. And we've been mentioning streaming fraud or artificial streaming a few times already. It's something that, we've all heard and we all say, but what does that really mean? What is streaming fraud?
It means manipulating how many times a song is played, and it's not an organic play or a real play on the other end. So there's lots of ways this occurs. One way could be you create a bot account or fake accounts. Maybe you create 40 accounts and you have them all streaming your music nonstop. That's an inorganic play. Like that's not a real user listening to a real song. That's artificial. Another way could be that you steal someone's account and you log in and you play a song of your choice, but it's not them playing. So maybe I accidentally get your account credentials and I log in as you and I play one of my friend's songs 4 times. Those 4 plays are inorganic. Like they weren't really listening to those plays for the joy of consuming music or because they're a fan. They're trying to manipulate the plays for some alternative reason. Most times, 80% of the time, that's a financial gain. That's where you see the really big organized crime and fraud syndicates like involved. The other 20% could be just perception. Like I'm just trying to push up the charts, get noticed by playlist editors, whatever. But I think the point is that 80% of the fraud we catch is not from the music industry. It's not like an artist trying to get noticed. It's not a big artist trying to stay on a chart. It's truly financially motivated fraud, people trying to steal money from the industry. And I think it goes back to how the industry makes money. And people think like when I stream a song, I automatically get, 0.003 cents or something. How it actually works is all the money that streaming service makes, the subscription revenue and the advertising for that month goes into one pool. And that pool is then divided by how many people played songs. So if you're an artist and you did 1 of 10 plays on that streaming service, you get 10% of that pool. If you did 1 of 20, you get 5% of that pool. The problem is every month the pool changes because there's a different number of streams and there's a different amount of money that they've made from subscribers and advertising. And so you could have a song in November that generates $200 and you could have the exact same traction and the exact same song and make $42 in January or February. And so you don't actually know what you should be making at any one time because it's performance based. And what fraudsters have realized is that you don't know what other people are making. You don't even know why you're supposed to be making what you make. And it's a complicated math equation. And if they load a bunch of music onto platforms pretending to be independent artists, so they create different artist names, different labels in different countries, and they'll load millions of tracks onto streaming services. And they don't have to just do one. They could do it across 100 different streaming services. And then what they do is they just slowly play their song. Maybe they only play their song 100 times, 1,000 times over the course of a month or 2 months, but just very small amounts of plays, but across millions of tracks. No one notices the individual artist or the individual track that only got 600 streams over 2 months. But if they do that enough times across enough streaming services, across enough songs, they can extract money that would have otherwise been paid to the artist. Because remember, it's that pro rata system. So even though they're taking pennies on each individual artist, they have so many pennies that it's pulling from everyone else. And they're stealing $2 to $3 billion a year this way from the industry.
That's absurd. 2 to 3 billion. Wow. So I was about to ask how prevalent it is, but that shows the monetary how prevalence of it. But in terms of like how many, are you able to give numbers on how many or what percent of like artists are being affected on DSPs?
I would say all artists are affected, whether you're an independent artist or not, because it's not the artist causing the problem. It's not like independent artist A is suddenly stealing money from independent artist B. It's like scammers who are pretending to be like they're in the industry, stealing money from everyone. So in this case, we're all on the same side of the table. If we stop fraud, if Beatdapp does our job and stops fraud, um, from occurring, or we reallocate the money, it's not like it only goes to major artists. It gets spread evenly because it's a pro rata system back across. So every artist actually benefits roughly the same. The only difference is if you're an independent artist and you make 10 grand a year, maybe you make $11,000 now. So the 1,000 like absolute dollar amount might not be a huge difference in your life. But if you're a huge artist or you're a label with a bunch of different artists, you might make $200 million more a year, or $400 million more a year. And so that number is actually very relevant for you. But it's just made up by a bunch of larger artists. Everyone percentage wise is shifting the same when you remove the fraud out. You just benefit differently depending on how much of your performance is in the market.
Absolutely.
But we all benefit from stopping fraud.
100%. Let me clarify that question too, though. I think there were kind of two aspects to this. One is the monetary aspect, making less because fraudsters are inflating the streams on the platform so that they can make more, stealing money from artists. The other side of it is, and maybe this is a completely separate issue, but for those artists that are getting flags for artificial streaming, in which they claim that they've done nothing on purpose or maybe nothing at all that could potentially get them on like botted playlists or just botted streams. Is that something that is a result of these fraudsters still trying to increase their money and take it away from artists, or is that like a totally separate issue?
It can be both, but I would say a lot of times if the there's two that's a great question, but there's two in that is that something they knew about or were being affected by? There's kind of two streams there. If you used the first one, let's just tackle as perception based. If you went to like a marketing firm, which is where this most happens with artists when they don't realize, they hire what they think is a legitimate firm that promises them a certain amount of streams per dollar, and they say they have all these like real users and they can generate real results and like this is what you should expect. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And in that case, no matter what they tell you, most commonly they have bots working in the background to help generate and hit those KPIs that they need clients. They may think that it won't go detected, which is where maybe they've gotten away with it some, but then all of a sudden they don't, and then now you look like you've created or participated in fraud as an artist. But all you know is you hired a marketing firm to help you, and so there's this element of sometimes the artist isn't knowingly doing anything bad. They've just hired a firm that is doing bad themselves. That's like the most common case when it comes to the independent artist who like paid for somebody but didn't realize and ended up being caught in a fraud scheme. There is a large amount of small artists that are also used in fraud schemes without knowing it. And the reason is if you're a fraudster, you can't just point the music back at yourself. Like if I steal accounts or if I create bots, I cannot only play my songs. It's like a giant arrow back to me. So what I need to do is create a haystack around my needle. And that means I need to pull people who don't know and then like build this apparatus as a shield. So I might have, if I'm pretending to be an independent artist, I want to be on all these independent artist looking playlists. I want to be that I might create as a fraudster. I might want to have users that play a lot of my song, but not really all of my song. Like I want to have maybe thousands of other users that it looks like, oh, this user could just be an independent music lover and they just really like my song a little more than others. And so they will create these sort of scenarios and fields. But once that account is detected as fraudulent, all the other users that are associated and benefiting from that user streaming or that fraudulent account streaming, they will then be penalized and or have money removed. And so you sometimes get caught up or swept up into a fraud scheme. And if you think about that, to hide, I might play for one stream, I might need to play another 1,000. And so if you think about it like that, that means like for every 100,000, I'm playing, 10 million. And that other 900, 9,900,000 streams, those artists didn't know.
That's
And so
crazy.
sometimes you're just caught into this giant web of lies or this like network of fraud as an artist because someone stumbled across you and thought, oh, we should plug them into this system and build as part of our sort of fraud apparatus.
That is crazy. What I have a
And
few
we
follow-up
Beatdapp
questions.
tries
Yeah.
to fight that. So when we work with streaming services, we tell them who we believe is fraudulent, not just on the streaming. Like we give them fraud results on the artist level, the track level, the underlying users, but also we tell them who are the perpetrators. So because we have a lot of technology that will allow us to kind of pull that apart and say, here's the, you know, 4,000 artists that were part of this fraud scheme. These three artists were actually the problem. So that we try to help, we try to do our part so that the 3,997 other artists aren't just penalized because they were part of it. We really only go after the three that are causing the apparatus to be there in the first place. And so, we really try to double click there and go deeper so that we don't harm, artists themselves.
Sure. How bulletproof is that? Like, what's that success rate of pinpointing those three versus the other 3,997 or whatever the
For
exact
us,
numbers?
99.99%. Like we only call something fraud when we are absolutely confident. Our false positive rate is like 0.0001%. So we have to be like, we would rather let the fraud go through than penalize an artist. So that's unique to us. I think most, if you think about fraud detection for banks, like if they're wrong, who cares? The user will just complain and they'll sort it out and then they'll figure out, oh, this wasn't fraud and they'll fix it. You don't really have that opportunity in music because the volume is so great and
Mhm.
because there's not as many back and forth. It just is too cost expensive. It's too expensive to have an arbitration channel constantly with everybody. So we never want to be in the position of hurting an artist's career. And so for Beatdapp, we spend massive amounts of resources, not just in R&D, but also in validating all of our models constantly. So we will not penalize an artist unless we are absolutely certain it's fraud. And we won't even provide those results back to the DSP or the streaming service unless we're confident it's fraud. Instead, what we say is it's suspicious. So there are lots of artists, I won't shame them here, where like you or I would look at the data and say, that's obviously fraud. Like sometimes I see stuff and I'm like, that's obviously fraud. But there might be a statistical reason it's not. There could be a plausible, like we actively work to disprove our own results. And so if we're not absolutely certain that it's fraud, it won't go through. And so we actually just mark it as suspicious and sort of like have a bunch of other stuff. And over time, maybe we decide we have enough evidence now to be sure. But generally speaking, like we need to be absolutely confident that it's fraud, and or if we're going to take any recommended action against them. And it's because we'd rather be sure than hurt someone's career, especially an independent artist, especially someone who's like in music, especially, there's so much noise that sometimes you're forced to be creative. And there's a lot of really cool creative ways to launch your music. And what you don't want to do is just penalize people because it's an outlier, because maybe that outlier was something that was actually just creative. And
Mhm.
so we spend a lot of time focusing on what are all the creative ways and how do we prove that it's not fraud, not just lump them together and say it's suspicious. I think that's
No,
what makes us unique,
yeah, no,
why we're tailor made for music.
and that's a great approach to take. I got a lot of follow-up questions with what you said there, and that was all great. So I appreciate you sharing that. First one here. So you mentioned that fraudsters are going to kind of pull in other accounts, so not everything directs back to them. Two questions with that. One is there something artists can do to protect themselves so they don't get pulled in? And like, so for example, are fraudsters looking at like those that are on playlists, those that are running ads or anything, or is it just completely random?
I don't have any evidence as to where they pick people and how they pick them. I think the two things you can do for yourself to protect yourself in general is there's a couple things I would say if you're an independent artist. One, um, I would, one is digitally fingerprinting your song. So that normally happens through distribution when you go to release. So if you can, I would put songs, even if they're um, not yet going to be scheduled to be released, I would put them through your distributor onto the platform, so that they're fingerprinted as yours with a timestamp. Because if anyone gets a hold of your track, so this is one way fraudsters have ripped off people. They've combed user generated platforms, for example, where you upload your music for other people. Sometimes those aren't digitally fingerprinted. So if you've never released that song somewhere else, there's no actual like copyright date or digital fingerprint date for all the streaming services to know that that's your song. So if someone steals your song off a user generated platform and uploads it themselves as an artist, then all of a sudden they look like they created the song and they are the ones with the timestamp. So then when you finally go to release your song on a Spotify, Apple, YouTube, whatever, they're going to go check the digital fingerprinting, database with ACR Cloud or Audible Magic or whatever, because that's the service that they use in between. And they're going to say, oh, this song's owned by this other person. And then you'll spend the next 6 months trying to argue that it's your song. So that's one way to protect yourself, is to make sure that before you release things publicly, and if you are going to release them on some user generated platform, I would fingerprint them by releasing it through your distributor or putting it onto a platform somewhere so it gets fingerprinted at some point. That's step one. Step two is that the moment that you see streams that aren't from you, like you can't plausibly isolate where these streams came from, and it just looks like you're getting a massive amount of streams from a playlist you've never heard of, for an editor you've never talked to, from a playlist you've never even seen before or don't know anyone on. I would tell your distributor, I'm not doing this, so that you have an email chain and a date with the immediate time that it's happening as proof that you wanted to stop this and you're not the one causing it. And that'll help you, because when you do fight for it later, if you do get flagged, at least you have evidence that you were proactive in trying to prevent it. Like you weren't just willfully blind and sort of allowing it to occur. So the reason you want that to happen is, if let's say that you end up with like the worst case scenario is that your track has a bunch of fraud on it. Like let's say you got 3 million streams that were fraud and 1 million that were legit. If they just take it off and re-put it on, you also lose the 1 million that were legitimate. So what you want to try and fight for is just to have the streams that were fake removed, not the entire song removed and then put back on. Because when it's removed and put back on, you lose all your place in the algorithms, and all the things that have gone your way to try and help you now get removed, and all those real streams are also removed, and then it just looks like you have a track up there that no one really liked, or you have a hard time sort of getting the traction. So if you can create an email to your distributor that says, hey, I noticed this problem, that's a great thing to do, because at least you have proof that it's not your fault, and people are more willing to try and help you out and make sure that it minimizes the damage to you at that point. And then the third thing you can do is just, if you have the opportunity to work with a distributor who is not a high volume distributor, one that takes a percentage of your sales but knows every single customer directly. So think like there's a lot of smaller distributors who sort of think of them like more of a white label, like they're talking to you about your creative, they're helping you pitch to different streaming services. I think a good way to know if you're that person is like, do I have a point of contact with a cell phone I can call? Like, because that is
so
like
true.
They're not going to give that to everybody, and if you have someone you can call internally, that's good too, because when a lot of the fraud sort of lives on these volume based platforms, and so when these platforms get punished, it will trickle to all the other artists. So it's good for you to, as an artist, if you can, to be with a smaller platform where you have a personal relationship with the representatives.
Absolutely. That's what I preach to, because like, I mean, with the kind of the big three distributors, they're distributing over 50% of music to Spotify, and getting a hold of anyone on the support team is, I don't like to use the word impossible, but it's pretty hard.
Difficult, challenging.
Yes. Let me get this. I just want to get the whole like kind of flow right of how this works. So, do you like I believe you're an independent company from like Spotify, like there's no partnership or anything there. Am I right in saying that?
We're completely neutral. No one owns us. Like we have no ownership from the labels. We have no ownership from the streaming services.
Yeah.
We are the sort of Switzerland in the middle, the neutral source of truth. So we say exactly what the numbers are to everybody, but we are not we're not owned by any of them. And our job is just to be the sort of that source of truth, the neutral third party.
Perfect. I like that. So just in understanding kind of the flow of how this works, are you letting Spotify know that fraud has been detected? Spotify then lets the distributor know, and the distributor can take any action, or is it the DSP like Spotify that takes the action? Is it you that takes the action? Like, let's say when a song is removed, who's actually, removing it off the platform?
So we work with streaming services.
Yes.
So we work with lots of different customer types, but
Right.
in this case, for the flow directly with artists, we work with the streaming service and we tell the streaming service, like, we're getting all of their data. We get gyroscope, battery life, orientation. Like, I know what orientation and degree your phone was at when you played a song. I know everything you've done in app before you've played it and after you've played it. I know your preferences and which features you use in the app. And a feature could just be like going to your recently played often to see what you've looked at last. Like, everyone uses their phone and their application that they're using in a different way. And we can see all these nuances and build sort of like a DNA of your listening pattern. So we know who you are as a person, even though it's completely anonymized. Like, they don't give us any personal information. It's anonymized, but we know this user behaves this way and has this natural behavior flow. So from that, we're able to identify when that flow changes, when suddenly a different activity is occurring that no longer matches who that person is. And so we can detect when accounts have been what's called an account takeover. There's lots of ways to detect that, but we have a lot of models. We have like 600 something models looking at things constantly from different directions. And so we identify when that occurs. So when we every day actually, so we do daily, weekly, monthly. So every day we provide the streaming services. Here's all the fraud we caught yesterday for the day. Like, we do it at midnight. So here's all the fraud we caught today. We do that mostly for charting and for recommendation engines. So if there is fraud, they don't make it worse. And for charting, they can provide the correct number to the charts. At the week mark, we do it again. It's mostly at that point for charting. So because they have a chance to update the charts before the charts come out for the week. So we give them that last sort of help at the week mark. At the month, we give them a full amount, and that one's for sales. That's for the actual royalties being paid out. Typically at the end of the month, a report is generated and they will send that to their partners, and their partners are the distributors, who then pass it on to the labels. If you're a really big label, you might have a direct deal with the streaming service, and you might have your own distribution. So think of like the majors. They will get the report the same time the distributors get the report. So what we do is we give them the end of the month. And the reason the end of the month one is important is the really sophisticated fraud might do it so subtly that we won't be confident it's fraud until 3 weeks in. So we're like watching these users over time and seeing how they manipulate streams over time. And they might be so subtle that we don't reach that confidence level until deeper into the month. And so that's why we do the monthly analysis too. So when that monthly comes out, those are the ones we're absolutely confident in. And we give back to the streaming services, not just who was fraud, like these users we believe were fraudulent, these artists are fraudulent, these tracks for these artists were fraudulent, these albums were fraudulent. Like, we give them everything along with, we're not black box. So we give them, our confidence levels, all of the flags they tripped in our models, so they can see exactly why we believed what we believed. And it's never like, it's not never, but it's rarely one thing where it's like, oh, this artist tripped a flag, so they're fraud. It's normally, here's 47 flags they tripped and all of the reasons why we believe it's fraud, and we're 99.999999% positive. And then the chances it's real are like 1 in 100 trillion. And so like you look at that and it's like just very obvious. And so we give them sort of recommended suggestions, but we don't actually take the action. So when we hand it back to the streaming service, we say, this is an account that looks like they got hacked, but they're not fraudulent themselves, just password reset. this is an account that's a fraudulent bot. The entire account's fraud. You should completely shut down that user and cancel the account. This artist is fraudulent, but they're not the ones that are the problem. So don't punish this artist. But here's the number of streams and exactly which artists they tie to, or which users they tie to, and don't pay them for fake streams. Here is the artist. 99% of their streams are fraudulent, and they're very engaged in this fraud scheme. And here's all the evidence you need. So we give them all of this stuff. Now the streaming services take action based on what we give them, and then they will communicate down the chain. So they will decide what they're going to do internally. Are we going to remove these artists, keep these artists up? Who are we going to penalize? Who do we provide artificial streaming reports to? And then they tell the distributors, these artists are bad. You need to have a talk with them, or we're not paying you, or you owe us money because we accidentally paid you too much, whatever. So we provide the information to the streaming services, and then they communicate that to their partners accordingly, and they decide the actions to take.
Do you know how they decide to? Because I assume it's all automated on Spotify.
No. I think a lot of it, some of it might be automated, but I think a lot of it is still manual. I think most platforms really, as much as especially the big ones might get flack for maybe not being as artist friendly as they could be, I do believe most of the people that work at these platforms were previous artists or artist manager.
Sure.
At the end of the day, you're working this business because you love music. And I think that doesn't change just because you were wearing a different jersey, across the aisle. And so for them, I think they look at that and they're like trying to do the best they can, but there's just so much volume going up, and I think that's the hard part. And so I don't think it's fully automated yet, because I think they would like to take it a case by case basis as much as possible. But I do believe there are pieces and recommendation, like how we provide feedback, there's easy cases to flag and move on, and then there's cases that are going to take a little bit more time for them to decide what they're doing. But it's not as automated as I think you would think it is. It's still, I think that's why they're kind of slowly rolling it out and adjusting how they do things. And no one wanted to come across the top and just start cutting people out at the knees. So I think it's sort of a work in progress across the industry.
Definitely, that makes sense. Is Beatdapp exclusive with Spotify, or does Spotify have other kind of fraud detection agencies that they are working with? Are you able to?
So when it comes to streaming services, we don't tell anyone who our clients are. We have a lot of publicly traded streaming services in general. But until they come out and publicly say that we work with them, we're just more of a ghost in the background. So to date, I think the only ones that are public that I can speak to are probably Napster, the Mechanical Licensing Collective, Sound Exchange, and MLC and Sound Exchange are obviously not streaming services. I think Beatport is one that was public. So when they announce it, then I'm happy to talk more about relationships with different streaming services. But in general, we do our best to respect their privacy and just we do the work of helping them identify fraud. But most times we are I would say the only ones in the stack that do. So most times they do have an internal team. Even some of our customers have a full internal team. We're sort of a bolt-on product. If you think about it, it costs tens of millions of dollars to develop the technology we have. It makes no sense for every streaming service to continually do that. They're the best at delivering content and providing the best user experience to their users to consume content. Nobody wants to be the FBI of streaming. And for them, if you think about taking all your best data scientists who could be building really cool features for users and telling them to go catch bad guys, there's a giant waste of your most talented resources. So for them, they would rather outsource that element to us so that we can identify the fraud and then have their internal team automate or deal with how to process all of that, as opposed to putting a team of 40 or 50 just on solving this problem. And if you replicate that across all the streaming services, just the amount of money they would spend annually doesn't make any sense. So we're sort of the undifferentiated heavy lifting. We can build that exact function for them and they can turn it on, and they might have some people doing and handling it internally. But at the end of the day, we'll end up doing it far better and far faster and far less expensive than if they try to handle it themselves. And a large reason for that is that that's all we do. That's all we focus on. We have scale. We also see fraud start on small services early, and then we can build protection models for everyone across the board. So instead of being reactive, you're proactive. So if you're a large streaming service, you'll see it immediately as it's coming onto your platform, not 6 or 9 months later when you manually run into it by accident and then find out that it was a big problem. So we're constantly making them better. And because our data is so big and because we have so much streaming data from all these different streaming services, we're just faster and more accurate at catching them all.
Right on. I got so many questions here, and I'm not even asking them because you're just saying this great information.
Oh,
And I keep
sorry.
asking. No, it's awesome, and
My
I keep
bad.
going into follow-ups, and I got another one here for you. So, in terms of like when fraud is detected, I think you just mentioned Beatdapp is one of the fastest, which it sounded like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, 3 weeks to a month to be 100% certain. Am I right in saying that? And
No, we're certain. Every time we call it, we're certain. It's just a matter of how much did we catch. So on
okay,
day one, let's say we might catch 70% of fraud.
okay,
But in that 70%, we're certain on every one of those cases. Within a week, we might catch 93 or 94% or 95% of fraud, and we are certain on each one of those cases. But there's going to be a nuanced amount of fraud that occurs that is like really smart and does stuff in different ways. For example, there was a unique device type, and because we get everything, we know exactly what phone you're using, what operating system you're on, like your IDs. Like we have a lot of stuff. It's anonymized, but it's unique. There was one type that we were like, that's weird. Why? We've never seen this account. Like we've never seen this type of device before. But there's hundreds of thousands of these devices being used in a fraud scheme. And it turned out, it took us a while to figure out, but it turned out that someone had hacked the US prison system and they were using the tablets from prison to stream content. And only those tablets are made for prisons. Like they don't sell them to anyone else. That's why it was a device type we'd never seen before.
unbelievable.
So like day one, we weren't going to be able to call that. Day 7, we weren't going to be able to call that. But by the end of the month, we were able to call that. And so those are the types of, I would say, bespoke fraud that we're catching over time because they're so sophisticated or so subtle or so nuanced that we need time to prove that it's fraud or not. And so in that case, those are the ones that we're delivering. So what you get at the end of the month is like our final, here's all the fraud we caught that we're certain of.
Right.
But we're catching most of it in day 1 through 7.
I gotcha. Okay. Right on. Moving on a little bit from that, but still
No
talking
worries.
about streaming fraud. Like, we work with a lot of artists from those releasing their first song up to major label and household names. And, I have access to a decent amount of artists, Spotify for artists. So I'm always looking at that data, which isn't the most in depth, but it is something. And one thing I've seen, a few times is just this massive spike on their Spotify for artists. And it shows kind of like a day after, like Spotify for artists is a little delayed, so you can't really pinpoint a lot of the times exactly what it came from, at least just the everyday user. But I think on one example, the streams per listener, average streams per listener was like 2 to 3, and then on this one day it was like 9. And that client received a notification from their distributor that due to artificial streaming, their song was going to be removed. And we could very clearly see that that was the issue. Going back to what you said earlier, where you kind of tell the DSPs, and I say Spotify all the time just because, that's the main one, but always referring to them all, that there are like 3 issues. One, this artist was affected, but they're not the root cause. One, like they're the root cause, etc. And that kind of gets passed down the chain of command, so to speak. When it gets to the distributor, so if Spotify decides not to remove it, but they still want to inform the distributor, can the distributor can then remove it and say that Spotify told them it was artificial streaming, which is true. It was, but that artist wasn't the issue. What I'm getting at here is there a solution to that? And I know that's kind of out of Beatdapp's area of expertise, but just asking yourself here, like, is there a
Well,
solution
with the
there?
distributor, we don't we work with it. We have the whole distribution product. So we work with distributors as well and say, hey, if you're one of our customers, we will also tell you if the artist was uh, fraudulent or the perpetrator. And how we do that is we're not allowed to share data. So what we end up doing is taking all the data the distributor has and then analyzing it and giving them similar results that we would with the streaming service. But we never pass it along. So we'll never take an artist that we know that's fraudulent on streaming and then just tell the distributor. We actually have to find them in earnest on our own. So we run a bunch of models specific to them, find the fraud and help them identify the fraud and then take action there. When we, the ones that I think are the most public right now, obviously, when they do this is going to be, Spotify, with their artificial streaming reports, and I think Apple and then TikTok. But we do this for a bunch of streaming services. So generally speaking, what happens is the distributor is notified and I'd say the most common case is not just take the artist down. Like when they take the artist down, it's generally because 90+% of all of their streams are fraudulent, not just one. And in most cases, it's over like a 3-month period. So you've proven that you have like a long-term fraudulent activity, whether you benefited from them, created it or not, like you were part of it. And I think in that case, they're saying in most cases, even if we remove you and we allow you to re-upload later, all of these streams get removed. And as an independent artist, who cares? It's not that many streams if you're a big, like you should be focusing on building fans, not building a vanity number. So I think like that's sort of the argument there. But I would say that it's really the distributors will take action based on what they think is best. And you have to remember the distributors don't want to be caught in the middle and have a bunch of fraud because there's clawbacks that come to them too. So
Right.
if you're a distributor and you're caught and you have a lot of fraud on your system and you're getting told you have a lot of fraud on your system, what some streaming services are doing now are coming back to them and say, hey, here's all the fraud we caught for the last 3 years. You owe us $50 million back. And then they have to figure out how they're going to pay that because they've already paid that out to the artists. And those fraudulent artists who got away with it, they're not refunding anyone money. Those are fake artists that are gone. So, I think that the reason you're seeing distributors take action is that they don't want to be caught liable for this in between. And also think about it, like the distributors are the ones that know their customer or should know their customer more. They're the ones making the final payout. When I went back and told you that 80% of fraud is financially motivated, you have to ask yourself why. And a lot of that is professional organized crime, money laundering, terrorist groups, people that like none of us want getting access to free capital. And, it's not going to take long before the US government comes down on anyone paying services, paying customers out, just the same way they do with banks and they did with PayPal and they do with Venmo or whatever. Like if you're inadvertently funding terrorist activities, whether you knew it or not, if you had the ability and the data to prevent it and you didn't, like you're in trouble. So I think part of this also is just broader than like, is this artist known to me? It's also like the risk around what happens if this artist turns out to be a terrorist or turns out to be an organized crime like syndicate. And so I think that's like a real issue that they have to deal with. And it's a tough place for them to be.
Absolutely. I know you mentioned earlier that artists might not get paid in the next couple of years due to, I believe it was DIY distributors, but if I'm wrong on that, let me know. And can you just elaborate on that?
This is totally hypothetical because I have no idea how it's going to play out, but
Okay.
there is a more than likely scenario, I believe, where the streaming services go after the distributors because keep in mind they've benefited. If you're a distributor, so last month, let's say we had 40 distributors with over 50% of all of their streams are fraudulent. And these are like household name distributors. So imagine 50% of your revenue-based business that's taking a percentage of your revenue is fraudulent revenue. So if you trail that back 2 or 3 years, and now the streaming services, who in the last year or two now all have Beatdapp, and they're getting these reports, and they're analyzing back, and they realize I accidentally paid this distributor $110 million I should have never paid. Like these are fraudulent streams I should have never paid for. What's likely happening and what we're seeing happen is what's called like a refusal to pay or a clawback or issuance of credit. What they're saying is maybe you don't have to pay us back because you realize you, distributor, don't have the money anymore, but you owe us $100 million over the next 5 years. If you're a distributor and your total annual budget is 20 million and you're told you owe 100 million over the next 5 years, because remember, they only take a percentage of the money, they pass the rest of it through to you. So now I'm a distributor and I owe X DSP $100 million. How am I going to operate? So there's this issue now where they have to figure out who's fraudulent, which artists were fraudulent on their end. They have to figure out who's getting paid and who's not. And there's a more than likely scenario, in my opinion, where streaming services say, distributors, we've paid you way too much money. We're treating it like a credit that you have to pay off. And then they have to figure out which artist they're going to pay with the remaining money they have left. And if you're an artist that is not a big artist that makes them the most amount of money, which in almost any business, a power law, like your top, 10% of users pay for most stuff.
Right.
If you're on the bottom half of that, I believe there'll be a more than likely scenario where payments are late. They don't pay you on time. Maybe the rent you were hoping to pay. Maybe you only make $2,000 a month from streaming, but it's like a really important $2,000 a month to you because you're a struggling artist trying to make it, and that paid for your car or your kids' tuition or whatever. Like imagine just not getting those payments anymore simply because of which distributor you used. You didn't do anything wrong. You just caught up in their problem. And I think that's going to be a very big fallout over the next 2 to 3 years.
Interesting. So I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist. And I know that fortunately there is corruption in the world. And I'm not by any stretch of the imagination calling anyone out. But in theory, would it be possible that a distributor that does owe DSPs, let's say 100 million over 5 years, would benefit from removing their client's music and then not having to pay out royalties on that then they can use to pay back Spotify?
No, because they still owe you the money regardless. They can't just like not pay you. It'll just be how long does it take them to pay you out? And if they don't comply, do they get kicked off the stores in between? So there's also some weird stuff that happens with your distribution deal where sometimes, let's say that you got an advance, you're an artist who got an advance for a specific distributor. A lot of times those advances might be exclusive. So until you've recouped, you can only distribute through them. So now imagine being an artist that's stuck in a distribution deal where you have a recoupable, but they're no longer allowed to distribute to Apple, Spotify, and YouTube because they've been kicked off for fraud. So now you're distributing your music to a smaller pool of people, but you can't leave. There's there's a whole world of problems that can come from sort of picking the wrong, distributor. So what I always tell, and listen, just getting a distributor is just as hard as getting signed by a label. Like I'm under no
that's a fact
illusion
right there.
that it's easy. It's like people make it sound like, oh, just pick a different distributor. Like you might not have the option, so that's fine. But what I'm saying is, if you have the option to pick someone who will handhold you, to pick the smaller distributor who really cares about you and cares about how your career is going, even if they take a higher percentage, I would do that deal all day, every day, than a mass distribution platform where I don't necessarily have like a specific contact that I can call when I have a problem. So if you are fortunate, if you're the fortunate few that have that opportunity, I personally wouldn't look at how much I'm giving up to be part of that. I would be looking at like how much risk am I avoiding by having that person? Because
100%.
it's a long-term view, but I just think that having someone that you can count on to help build your career is a lot better than saving a few dollars on the front end.
Totally agree with you on that one. Yep. 100%. We're nearing the end of the episode here. I just got
Nice.
one kind of final question here, and then I'd love to give you a chance to just share anything that you would like. But just before then, I know you mentioned that you're right 99.9999% of the time. Love that. I'm sure other companies are right, maybe a little less than that. If ever there is a case where an artist, you know, genuinely believes everything they did was legit, have all the proof to back it up. I know the process right now is seems to be to submit that to your distributor, and your distributor will submit that to Spotify. Does that ever come back to you to just give it one final approval, or is that next step of analyzing any proof like that, is that done by Spotify or the DSPs? But yeah.
It's done with everyone in conjunction. So if it's a big enough case or a lot enough money, like especially if it's a big enough case, like we will be involved and we will help them because we'll try to walk them through why we made that. Like we'll show them why we made that decision so that everyone has the same information across the board. And so when that happens, a lot of because remember the distributor doesn't always have the same information as the streaming service, right? So
Right.
they don't see what we see. So in that case, we will show them what we see and then they'll say, "Oh, like so far, so far, it's always been like, yeah, that's fraud." Like that's typically what happens, especially on that type of case. But if we're wrong, for us, we haven't been wrong yet, like in a big way. We pay for it. So Beatdapp insures all the streaming services for the like if we're wrong, we're the ones that pay for it. That's also why we're conservative on it. So if we mess up, we own it. Like that's how it works.
Right on. I like that. Well, Andrew, been an absolute pleasure chatting. I really appreciate, all the light you
Same.
shed on this awful issue of streaming fraud, which seriously needs to end. Just before I conclude this episode, is there
Totally.
anything else you would like to share?
Yeah, I know it's hard to be an artist. I used to break artists in the 2000s on the promo side, and I used to, I released a song back in 2022 in country just for fun to kind of go through the experience again, and we charted. We were number 4 U.S. country music single that week, and I think that
Congrats.
what I did it in a very weird way. I pulled a bunch of fan clubs together and helped them promote our song. So it looked like fraud for sure. Like we got flagged as an anomaly, and I had to like quickly prove that we didn't do anything wrong. So I know what it's like to be on the other side, and so that's also partly why we work really hard to make sure that the artists aren't in trouble when they do something creative. And so I guess what I'm just saying to artists is like if it feels too good to be true, it probably is. There really is no substitute for the hard work. And I think in this day and age, to get people's real attention requires building a sort of emotional relationship with them. And often that's the form of one-by-one shows, like sitting on stage at the end of a show and meeting fans. And like if you could think that every community you go to, you really build a handful of relationships and you just stack those up and you just put the time in, like there's no silver bullet, and streaming is definitely not the silver bullet, but um, do all the other things that an artist has to do to be great and just lean into the work. And I think that that's my advice to artists every time is that um, it's always going to be hard work. There's no shortcuts, and just lean in.
Well said. I will have links below for you to get in touch with Andrew. And for you listening in, I want you to know that not everyone is out to get you in this industry. There are people like Andrew who, through Beatdapp, are creating a platform and have created a platform to help you earn more from your music by eliminating streaming fraud. In the meantime, that is going to conclude this episode. Until next time, I've been Mac, that's been Andrew, and you've been amazing. Take care and keep making music.